Most television shows take a long time to find their voice, and most never become anything more than what they were when they started. The Simpsons began as 5 rough sketches a man drew in an office lobby because he did not want to give up the rights to a different cartoon. From those sketches, the show became a phenomenon that sold 15 million t-shirts in a single year, made schools across America ban a single yellow boy from their hallways, drew an active reply from a sitting president, killed off a beloved supporting character over the cost of one airline flight, took 18 years to become a feature film, switched from hand-drawn animation to high definition almost overnight, lost characters to real-world deaths and cultural reckonings, was acquired by one of the largest entertainment companies on Earth, and somehow kept going long enough to become the longest-running scripted primetime series in American television history. This video walks through that long evolution. Welcome to Yellow Fan. Let's get started. The lobby sketch that built a universe. The story of the Simpsons universe does not begin in a writer's room. It does not begin on a soundstage. It does not begin in any of the production buildings on the 20th Century Fox lot in Los Angeles, where the show would eventually be made for over 3 decades. The story begins in the lobby of an office on a single afternoon in 1986, with one cartoonist sitting on a chair waiting to be called into a meeting that he had spent weeks preparing for and had assumed would go in a very specific direction. The cartoonist's name was Matt Groening. He was in his early 30s at the time. He had spent most of the 1980s working in obscurity in Los Angeles, drawing a small alternative weekly comic strip called Life in Hell, which featured a cast of rabbits and a fez-wearing character named Akbar. The strip had developed a small but loyal following on the alternative weekly newspaper circuit, particularly in college towns. The strip had not made him rich. The strip had not made him famous. But the strip had been good enough to bring his work to the attention of a man who would, that afternoon in the office lobby, change the entire course of his life and the entire shape of American animated television. The man was the producer James L. Brooks. Brooks, at that point in his career, was already one of the most respected names in American television comedy. He had created or co-created The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Rhoda, and Taxi. He had won Academy Awards in 1984 for the film Terms of Endearment. He had been hired by the Fox network, which in 1986 was a brand new American television network trying to build a primetime presence to compete with the established 3. Brooks had been put in charge of developing a sketch comedy program for the new network called The Tracey Ullman Show, named after the British comedian and dancer who would headline the program. Brooks had decided that the sketch comedy program would benefit from short animated wraparound segments that would air before and after the commercial breaks. He had seen Groening's Life in Hell strip somewhere, possibly in a copy of the LA Weekly. He liked the look of the rabbits. He had reached out to Groening through Groening's representatives. He had offered Groening the chance to come in and pitch a series of animated wraparound shorts that could be developed for the new program. The meeting was set. Groening prepared. The plan, as Groening understood it walking into the building that afternoon, was to bring Life in Hell to television. The rabbits would be animated. Akbar and Jeff would speak. The strip that had taken him most of his adult life to build would be expanded into a new format on a new network with a major producer attached. Groening sat in the lobby with his portfolio of Life in Hell strips on his lap. He waited to be called in, and then, somewhere in those few minutes between sitting down and being called into the meeting, Groening realized something that would change everything. If he licensed Life in Hell to Fox, he might lose the publication rights to the strip itself. The strip was his life's work. He had been drawing it weekly for years. He could not, in good conscience, hand over the characters to a network for a few minutes of weekly airtime. He needed something else. Something he could pitch in the next few minutes that would not require him to give up his existing work. Something that he could draw quickly enough to have something to show Brooks when he sat down in the meeting room. What Groening sketched in those few minutes, on the spot, in the office lobby, was a family. He drew 5 characters. He drew a heavy-set father with a balding head. He drew a tall, thin mother with a beehive of hair. He drew a son with spiky hair and a permanent expression of mischief. He drew a daughter slightly younger than the son. He drew a baby. He gave the family his own family's first names with one small substitution. The father was Homer, after his own father. The mother was Marge, after his own mother. The two daughters were Lisa and Maggie, after his own sisters. The son, the only one whose name did not match a real Groening relative, he called Bart, an anagram of the word brat. He gave them a last name that he thought sounded vaguely funny, a name that sounded close to the word simpleton, the Simpsons. He brought the rough sketches into the meeting with Brooks. Brooks looked at the sketches. Brooks accepted the pitch on the spot. The sketches were genuinely rough. Groening had assumed, as most cartoonists do when handing off character designs to a production team, that the animators would clean up the drawings before any of the work went on the air. The animators at the Klasky Csupo studio in Los Angeles, however, did not clean them up. They simply traced over Groening's actual sketches and started animating from there. The result was that the very first appearance of the Simpson family on television was a remarkably crude version of the family that the world would later come to recognize. Homer's hair was different. Marge's beehive was different. Bart's eyes were placed differently on his face. Lisa was a little less defined. The colors were wrong. In fact, the choice that the family would eventually be yellow, the choice that would later become one of the most recognized visual signatures in the history of American animation, was not even Groening's choice. The choice was made by a colorist at Klasky Csupo named Georgi Palouse. Palouse decided that the family should be yellow because she thought yellow would catch the eye of viewers who were channel surfing past the Tracey Ullman Show during commercial breaks. The decision was approved. The Simpson family was painted yellow. The signature look of the show that would later span 4 decades had been, at the moment of its creation, a quick choice made by a colorist looking for visual impact on a small television screen. The first short to air was titled Good Night. It aired on the Fox network in the United States on April 19, 1987, as a small segment within a regular episode of The Tracey Ullman Show. The short ran for slightly under 2 minutes. The plot was simple. Homer and Marge attempt to put their children to bed. Bart asks a question about the human mind that his father cannot answer. Lisa hears Marge mention bed bugs and becomes terrified. Maggie hears the lyrics of a lullaby and is upset by the lines about babies falling out of trees. All 3 children end up in their parents' bed. The voice of Homer was provided by Dan Castellaneta, an actor who was already part of the regular cast of The Tracey Ullman Show. The voice of Marge was provided by Julie Kavner, also a regular cast member on Tracey Ullman. The voices of Lisa and the other children needed to be cast separately. The casting team brought in Nancy Cartwright. Cartwright had originally been asked to audition for the role of Lisa. She read for the part, was unenthusiastic about playing a quiet middle child, and asked to audition for Bart instead. Brooks and Groening hired her on the spot. The role of Lisa eventually went to Yardley Smith, a young actress who had appeared in the 1986 Stephen King film Maximum Overdrive. The voice cast that would carry the show across the next 4 decades had been assembled. None of them had any idea what they were assembling. The shorts on The Tracey Ullman Show were primitive in a way that is difficult to overstate. The animation was done domestically at Klasky Csupo in a way that fans of the later show would barely recognize. The recording sessions for the dialogue were not conducted in proper studios. According to Cartwright, the dialogue for the early shorts was recorded on a portable tape deck inside a video engineer suite that was located, physically, above the bleachers on the Tracey Ullman Show set. The shorts ran in their first season irregularly, sharing time on the program with a separate animated segment called Dr. N. Godatu that has been almost completely forgotten by history. By the second season, the Simpsons shorts had become so popular that they appeared in every episode of the program. By the third season, the shorts had grown from the brief multi-part wraparounds to single, longer pieces that played in one block. 48 Simpsons shorts in total were produced for The Tracey Ullman Show across its run from 1987 to 1989. The earliest of those shorts featured a Homer with a voice that was much closer to the actor Walter Matthau than the voice he would later become. The earliest shorts featured a family that did not yet have the rounded, polished, instantly recognizable look that the later show would establish. The earliest shorts were, in 1987, a small recurring bit on a sketch comedy program that almost nobody watched. A 1990 marketing study would later find that only 14% of Americans had ever heard of the Tracey Ullman Show shorts. By comparison, by November of 1990, 11 months after the half-hour series launched on its own, 85% of Americans were familiar with the Simpson family. The decision to spin the family off into their own half-hour series was made by Brooks during the third Tracey Ullman season. The Fox network was looking for prime-time content. The shorts had become the most popular thing on the program. Brooks, Groening, and a third producer named Sam Simon, who would become the unsung architect of the entire writing operation, sat down to plan the new show. Simon would later be described by the director Brad Bird as the unsung hero of the early Simpsons. He would assemble the original writing staff, develop the procedures for how the show was actually made, and shape the tone of the early seasons in ways that the public would never fully understand. The original writing room that Simon assembled included John Swartzwelder, John Vitti, George Meyer, Jeff Martin, Al Jean, Mike Reese, Jay Kogan, and Wallace Wolodarski. That writing room would, across the next several years, produce some of the most acclaimed half-hours of television comedy in American history. None of them, in the spring of 1989, knew that yet. They simply knew that they had been hired to write a half-hour cartoon based on a family that had previously been a small wraparound segment on a sketch comedy program. The first half-hour episode produced was an installment titled Some Enchanted Evening. The animation that came back from the overseas studio that the show had outsourced its work to was so bad, however, that the episode could not be aired as the premiere. The producers shelved it and produced a new episode to debut the series. The new debut was a Christmas-themed half-hour titled Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. It first aired on the Fox network in the United States on December 17, 1989. The plot followed Homer Simpson, denied his Christmas bonus from the nuclear power plant, taking a temporary job as a department store Santa to earn money for presents. Homer loses the Santa money at the dog track. He returns home expecting to deliver bad news to his family, only to bring back a greyhound named Santa's Little Helper that had finished last in its race. The episode established the basic emotional shape of the show that would carry through the entire run. Homer fails. Homer is humiliated. The family forgives him. Something good comes out of the wreckage. The original lobby sketch had become a half-hour Christmas special. The Christmas special had aired. The audience had watched. The next phase of what would soon become a global phenomenon was about to begin. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of the lobby sketch is the story of how the show got made. The next story is what happened to the country when the show actually arrived on television, when a single yellow boy with spiky hair became famous enough to be banned from American schools. Section 2. Bart Mania and the Year the Country Lost Its Mind. The first season of the half-hour Simpsons series ran across the winter and spring of 1990. The show aired on the first Fox network on Sunday nights, in a slot that had not previously generated significant ratings for the new network. The early reviews were generally positive, without being overwhelming. Critics were intrigued by the look of the show. The animation was rougher than anything else on primetime American television. The family at the center of it did not behave like the families on the established Sunday night sitcoms. The father drank beer in front of the children. The son talked back to the parents in ways that earlier American sitcoms would not have allowed. The daughter read books and played the saxophone. The mother accepted the chaos around her with a kind of quiet resignation that was unfamiliar in American television comedy. Critics had no clear category for the show. The reviews ran, the episodes aired, the audience began to grow. And then, somewhere in the spring of 1990, something happened that nobody at the network or at the production company had predicted. The audience did not just grow, the audience exploded. And the explosion was concentrated almost entirely on a single character. The character was Bart Simpson. Bart in the early episodes of the show was the loudest of the children. He skateboarded through Springfield. He pranked his teacher, Edna Krabappel. He made obscene phone calls to Moe's Tavern. He looked directly at the camera at the start of every episode and wrote a different line on his school chalkboard during the opening sequence. The chalkboard gag became, almost immediately, one of the most beloved running jokes in American television. A new line every week, a new piece of mischief, a new declaration of unrepentant defiance from a 10-year-old boy with spiky yellow hair. Children across the United States, watching the show on Sunday nights with their families, latched onto him with an intensity that no other character on the show inspired. He looked like them. He talked like them. He did the things they secretly wanted to do. He hated school. He skateboarded, he broke the rules, and, crucially, the show let him get away with most of it. He was punished sometimes, yes. The show was not lawless, but the basic shape of the character was that of a boy who refused to apologize for who he was. The American audience of the spring of 1990, particularly the part of it under the age of 15, found in Bart something they had been waiting for without knowing they had been waiting for it. The merchandise market responded faster than the network had anticipated. By March and April of 1990, independent t-shirt manufacturers across the country had begun producing Bart Simpson shirts in enormous quantities. Some of the shirts were officially licensed by 20th Century Fox. Many of them were not. The unlicensed shirts in particular became a kind of underground phenomenon, sold at flea markets and street vendors and convenience stores, in versions that the network had never approved and could not control. The most famous of the licensed shirts featured Bart aiming a slingshot with the word underachiever printed in quotation marks above him, and the line, "and proud of it, man," printed below him. Another shirt simply read, "I'm Bart Simpson. Who the hell are you?" Another shirt featured Bart's catchphrase, "Eat my shorts." Another featured the line, "Don't have a cow, man." The shirts sold in numbers that nobody had predicted. By the end of 1990, an estimated 15 million Bart Simpson shirts had been sold in the United States alone. The merchandise revenue across all categories generated by the show in its first 14 months on the air, including the shirts, the dolls, the buttons, the bed sheets, the napkins, the air fresheners, the chewing gum, and dozens of other products that the network had hastily licensed, came to roughly $2 billion. A half-hour Sunday night cartoon based on a family of yellow people had, in less than 2 years, generated more revenue from merchandising than most film studios generated from their entire feature slate. The shirts were not received quietly by every American adult. In April of 1990, at Lutz Elementary School in Fremont, Ohio, the principal, William Crumnow, took to the public address system of his school to deliver an official ban. The ban applied to a single class of clothing item. Students at Lutz Elementary were no longer permitted to wear the underachiever and proud of it shirt to school. Crumnow explained his reasoning to the local Deseret News later that month. He said that to be proud of being incompetent was a contradiction of what schools stood for. He said his school worked to instill good values in children. He said the show taught the wrong things. The ban at Lutz Elementary was not the only one. School districts in Florida, California, Michigan, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. quickly issued similar restrictions. At Brookwood Junior High in Glenwood, Illinois, teachers ordered students wearing the shirts to call their parents and have a change of clothing brought to the school. Other schools forced students to turn the shirts inside out for the rest of the day. Some teachers placed adhesive tape over the offending words. The retail chain J.C. Penney, by the summer of 1990, had decided to remove the underachiever shirts from the children's section of its stores entirely. The reaction from the parents and from the broader public was genuinely divided. Some parents fully supported the school bans. They saw Bart as a corrupting influence on their children. They worried about what the character was teaching about authority, about education, about respect for adults. Other parents thought the bans were absurd. One mother, Jeanette Manning of Orange, California, told People magazine that she was considering buying a shirt for her son specifically because the schools had said he could not wear one. Another mother, Myra Romero, told the same magazine that she could not understand why her 11-year-old son, Alex, was being reprimanded for wearing a Bart shirt to school. She pointed out that she would much rather see her son wearing Bart Simpson than a heavy metal band shirt with a skull on it. Child development experts who weighed in on the controversy were also split. Some agreed with the schools. Others pointed out that telling children they could not have something tended to be the single most reliable way of making them want it more. Matt Groening himself, when asked about the bans by reporters, kept his comments brief. He said his folks had taught him to respect elementary school principals, even the ones who had nothing better to do than tell kids what to wear. He also pointed out, with mild satisfaction, that the word underachiever appeared on the shirt in quotation marks, which suggested that fictional school officials inside the world of the show had given Bart that label rather than Bart claiming it for himself. The phenomenon was given a name almost immediately. The press called it Bart Mania. The term was a deliberate echo of the older word Beatlemania, which had described the global obsession with the British rock band The Beatles in the 1960s. The implication of the term was clear. The yellow boy with the spiky hair had become, for the year of 1990, the most famous fictional child on the planet. He appeared on the cover of Rolling Stone. He appeared on the cover of People. Time magazine named him Entertainer of the Year for 1990. He was given a giant helium balloon in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in November of that year, joining a small handful of fictional characters who had ever earned that honor. The episode of The Simpsons that aired the same day as the parade, an installment titled Bart vs. Thanksgiving, included a small joke in which Homer told Bart that turning the parade into a farce by inflating a balloon for every flash-in-the-pan cartoon character was a mistake. The show had begun, even at the height of its merchandise-driven popularity, to make small jokes at the expense of its own commercial success. The bootleg shirts told their own separate story. The black market in unauthorized Bart Simpson merchandise across 1990 and into 1991 was enormous. Some of the bootleg shirts were innocent. They simply featured Bart in poses that the network had not approved. Other bootleg shirts redesigned the character entirely. There were Teenage Mutant Ninja Bart shirts. There were Air Simpson Bart shirts that combined Bart with the silhouette of basketball player Michael Jordan. There were Rasta Bart shirts. There were Black Bart shirts, in which the character had been redrawn with darker skin to appeal to a specifically African American consumer base. sold heavily at urban flea markets across the country, and often featuring quotations from rap songs. Most of these unauthorized variations were tolerated by Groening and the network. Networks sued only when the bootleg shirts crossed specific lines. The most notable lawsuit involved a series of Nazi Bart shirts produced by a man named Tom Metzger, in which Bart had been drawn in Nazi uniforms or as a white power skinhead. 20th Century Fox sued Metzger over the shirts. Metzger agreed to cease production. The deeper, broader, less offensive bootleg market continued without interruption. The merchandising explosion was not limited to the United States. By 1991, Simpsons merchandise had become a global phenomenon. The shirts sold in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Germany, in Japan, in Brazil, in Mexico, in nearly every country with a domestic television market that carried Fox programming. Bart became one of the most popular write-in candidates in the 1990 American congressional, senatorial, and gubernatorial elections, finishing second in many areas only to Mickey Mouse among fictional characters who received write-in votes. The phrase, "Bart Simpson, who the hell are you?" originally a t-shirt slogan, entered American slang. The phrase, "Eat my shorts," entered American slang. The phrase, "Don't have a cow, man," entered American slang. The catchphrase, "Ay caramba," which Bart had used in early episodes, entered American slang. None of those phrases had originated with the show's writers in any deep sense. "Eat my shorts" had been borrowed from the 1985 film The Breakfast Club, in which the character John Bender had said it to Principal Vernon. "Don't have a cow" had been a popularization of the older British phrase, "don't have kittens." The catchphrase, "cowabunga," which Bart sometimes used, had been borrowed from a 1950s American children's program called The Howdy Doody Show. The Simpsons had not invented these phrases. The Simpsons had simply collected them, given them to a yellow boy with spiky hair, and watched the country adopt them as if they had been invented yesterday. The most striking part of the entire Bart Mania period, in the long view of the show's history, is how quickly it ended. The intensity of the obsession with Bart specifically lasted for roughly 2 years. By the third season of the show, which aired across 1991 and 1992, the writing room had begun to shift the focus of the program away from Bart and toward Homer. The reasons were multiple. Homer was an easier character to build long episodes around. Homer's worldview was richer than Bart's. Homer's failures had more weight than Bart's pranks. The shift was not announced. The shift was simply made. By the middle of the third season, the show was no longer a Bart show. The show was a Homer show with Bart as a major supporting character. The merchandise explosion did not end immediately. The shirts kept selling. The dolls kept being produced. But the cultural moment of Bart Mania, the specific year in which a single character had been the entire face of the program, had passed. The boy who had been banned from elementary schools across America had become, almost without anyone noticing, just one member of an ensemble. The next phase of the show, the phase in which the writing would deepen and the characters would expand and the show would move toward what fans would later call its golden era, had quietly begun. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Bart Mania is the story of a year in which a cartoon character became more famous than most living American actors. The next story is the story of how that fame caught the attention of the most powerful man in the world, and what happened when a sitting president of the United States decided to pick a fight with an animated family. Section 3. The President, the Waltons, and the Chalkboard that Fired Back. The early 1990s were a strange period in American politics. The country had emerged from the long Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall had fallen in November of 1989. The Soviet Union itself would dissolve by the end of 1991. The United States was the only remaining superpower in the world. Inside the country, however, the political conversation had shifted away from foreign affairs and toward something the politicians and the press had begun to call family values. The phrase was used by political candidates across the spectrum, but it was used most heavily by the Republican Party, which had built much of its political identity in the 1980s around the idea that the traditional American family had been damaged by various cultural forces and needed to be restored. The president at the time was George Herbert Walker Bush, a Republican who had served as vice president under Ronald Reagan and had won the 1988 election. His wife was the former First Lady Barbara Bush, an enormously popular figure in her own right, often described in the press as the grandmother of the nation. The Bushes lived in the White House. They paid attention to American culture. They watched television. They had opinions about what they saw. And in the autumn of 1990, those opinions reached a magazine reporter and produced a comment that would, without anyone in the White House quite intending it, begin a feud between a sitting first family and an animated cartoon family that would last for years. The comment was made in an interview with People magazine. The interview was published in the October 1st, 1990 issue. Barbara Bush, asked about the cultural landscape of contemporary American television, told the reporter directly that The Simpsons was the dumbest thing she had ever seen. The quote was short. The quote was precise. The quote ran in the magazine without significant context around it. American readers picked up People that week, paged through the celebrity coverage, and read the First Lady's flat dismissal of the most popular animated program in the country. The Simpsons was at that exact moment in the autumn of 1990 at the absolute height of its cultural power. Bart Mania was in full swing. The merchandise was selling at unprecedented volumes. The schools were banning the shirts. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade was about to feature Bart as one of its giant balloons. The First Lady of the United States, in a single sentence, had set herself in opposition to all of it. The reaction inside the production of the show was not entirely what an outsider might have predicted. The producers and the writers, presented with the public criticism from the First Lady, did not respond with anger. They did not respond by mocking her on the show. They responded with what was, by every available account, a deliberate and somewhat puckish piece of personal correspondence. The writers drafted a letter. The letter was written from the perspective of Marge Simpson, the mother of the cartoon family. The letter was polite. The letter pointed out, with elaborate and slightly ironic courtesy, that the Simpson family had been working hard to instill good values in their children, that they tried their best to behave well, and that they were sorry to hear that the First Lady felt so strongly about their family. The letter was sent to the White House on appropriate stationery. The reply that came back, signed personally by Barbara Bush, was equally polite and equally surprising. The First Lady apologized to the Simpson family. She acknowledged that her comments had been spoken too loosely. She wished the family well. The exchange was, at the time, treated as a small piece of charming political humor. The First Lady had taken a swing at a cartoon family. The cartoon family had written her a letter. She had apologized. The matter, at least for a few months, appeared to be settled. It was not. The next round of the conflict came from the president himself, and it came in a far more serious context. By early 1992, President Bush was running for re-election. The American economy had slipped into a recession. His approval ratings, which had been extraordinarily high during the Gulf War of 1991, had begun to slide. The Republican campaign was casting around for messaging that could connect with voters in the new economic environment. Family values had emerged as one of the central themes. The president was scheduled to deliver a speech at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Washington, D.C. on January 27, 1992. The speech was meant to articulate the administration's vision for American family life. The speechwriters worked on the text. The president practiced. The speech was delivered in front of an audience of religious media figures and televised on national news. Buried inside the speech was a single sentence that almost nobody in the room knew was about to make news. The president said, in his calm and considered tone, that the administration was going to keep on trying to strengthen the American family, to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons. The reference required no explanation for the audience listening live. The Waltons had been a CBS drama that had aired from 1972 to 1981. The show had followed a large, traditional, rural family in Virginia during the Great Depression and the Second World War. The family had been deeply religious, hard-working, and quietly virtuous. The show had been the embodiment of a particular kind of American nostalgia for an idealized version of family life. The Simpsons, in the president's framing, represented the opposite of that ideal. The American family, the president was suggesting, had drifted away from the Waltons and toward the Simpsons. The remedy, in the president's framing, was to drift back. The line in the speech was meant as a passing piece of cultural commentary. The line in the speech became, within hours, a national story. The reaction at the production offices of The Simpsons was immediate. The writing room had been working on regular episodes. The schedule of new broadcasts and reruns had already been set. The next scheduled airing on the Fox network, just 3 days after the president's speech, was a rerun of the Season 3 episode, Stark Raving Dad. The producers, watching the news coverage of the Bush speech, made a decision that would have been considered nearly impossible in the era before digital production. They decided to write, animate, and insert a brand new short scene at the front of the rerun. The scene would respond directly to the president's comment. They had 3 days to do it. The animation pipeline of The Simpsons, even in the early 1990s, was a months-long process that involved storyboards, layouts, overseas animation, voice recording, and post-production. The producers compressed all of it into 72 hours. The new scene was written, the cast came in to record, the animators rushed the work through. The rerun aired on January 30th, 1992. The new scene that opened the rerun was simple in execution and devastating in effect. The Simpson family was shown sitting in their living room watching their television. On the television was footage of President Bush delivering the relevant line from his speech. The audio of the actual president speaking the actual words about the Waltons and the Simpsons played out in the cartoon living room. The camera held on the Simpson family. Bart, sitting on the carpet with his sister, looked up at the camera. He delivered the line that had been written for him by the writing room 3 days earlier. He said, in his own voice, that the Simpson family was just like the Waltons, because they were also praying for an end to the Depression. The reference to the Depression was a layered joke. The Waltons had aired during a period of American cultural memory tied to the Great Depression. The Simpsons in 1992 were, like millions of other American families, living through the early 90s recession. The President of the United States, who had publicly declared the recession to be a manageable economic adjustment, was being mocked from a cartoon living room in front of millions of American viewers for failing to manage the same recession that was affecting his real constituents. The joke landed. The joke landed hard. The joke became one of the most discussed pieces of political comedy on American television that month. The cartoon response to the president's speech was, in the long view of American television history, one of the fastest turnarounds from real-world political event to direct on-screen reply that the medium had ever produced. The traditional sitcoms of the era, with their multi-camera live audience taping schedules, could occasionally match a quick joke to a current event. The traditional animated programs of the era could not. The Simpsons production, by sheer force of effort across 3 days, had shown that an animated program could move at the speed of news when it needed to. The president himself, according to later reporting, was aware of the cartoon response but did not address it publicly. His campaign team had bigger problems to handle. By February of 1992, the president's approval ratings were in serious decline. By November of 1992, he had lost his re-election bid to the Democratic governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. The line in the religious broadcaster's speech, the line about the Waltons and the Simpsons, was not the cause of his defeat. The line was, however, one of the small cultural memories that survived from his single term in office. The phrase, more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons, became a kind of shorthand in American political commentary for decades afterward, often invoked by writers and pundits who wanted to summarize a particular kind of cultural conservatism that had attempted to lecture the country about its own television viewing habits. The feud between the Bushes and the Simpsons did not end with the cartoon rerun in January of 1992. The writing room of the show, even after the president left office in January of 1993, kept thinking about him. By the middle of the 7th season, which aired across 1995 and 1996, the showrunners Bill Oakley and David Merkin were still working on the show. Josh Weinstein decided that the feud had been allowed to fade away too quietly. They wanted to bring it back. They commissioned an episode that would put the former president and the former first lady directly into the world of Springfield. The episode was assigned to writer Ken Keeler. It was directed by Wes Archer. It was given the title Two Bad Neighbors. It first aired on the Fox network in the United States on January 14, 1996. The premise of the episode was that George and Barbara Bush, looking for a quiet place to retire away from political attention, had moved to Springfield because the town had the lowest voter turnout in America. The ex-president would, in the world of the show, be played by the regular cast member Harry Shearer doing an impression. The Bushes moved into the house directly across the street from the Simpson family. Bart's pranks quickly drove the former president to the breaking point. The conflict escalated when Bart accidentally shredded the only copy of the former president's memoirs with an outboard motor. The cartoon Bush spanked Bart for the offense. Homer learned of the spanking. Homer declared open warfare on the former president. The episode escalated into a series of escalating pranks between the two households. The cartoon Bush, at one point, threatened to ruin Homer like a Japanese banquet, a direct reference to a real incident in January of 1992 in which the actual president had vomited on the Japanese prime minister at a state dinner in Tokyo. Homer, at one point, called the cartoon Bush a wimp, a direct reference to a famous Newsweek cover from 1987 that had questioned the actual president's masculinity. The episode was full of these specific real-world references, but the writers themselves later insisted that the episode was not a political attack on Bush's policies. Bill Oakley, in interviews afterward, was specific about the framing. He said that the episode was not a political attack. He said it was a personal attack. He said the writers had wanted to poke fun at what they saw as the former president's general crotchetiness rather than at any specific aspect of his actual presidency. The distinction, in Oakley's mind, mattered. The episode ended with the Bushes leaving Springfield. The new family that moved in across the street from the Simpsons was, in a piece of follow-up writing that almost nobody saw coming, the family of former President Gerald Ford. Ford, in the cartoon, invited Homer over to watch a football game with beer and nachos. Homer accepted. The two of them got along immediately. The original concept for the closing gag had been to have Richard Nixon move in instead of Ford, but Nixon had died in April of 1994. The writers had then considered Bob Dole, who was running for the Republican presidential nomination at the time the episode was being produced. They eventually settled on Ford, on the theory that Ford was the American president who most closely resembled Homer Simpson in his general behavior and worldview. The episode aired, the audience watched. The feud between the show and the 41st president was, as far as the show itself was concerned, formally closed. The longer cultural memory of the feud, however, kept reappearing. In October of 2017, when allegations of past sexual harassment by the elderly former president were reported in the press, Simpsons showrunner Al Jean took to the social media platform Twitter to add a small final note to the long history. He posted that George H.W. Bush should perhaps act more like the Waltons than the Simpsons. He attached the hashtag 25-year-grudge. The post was widely shared. The grudge that had begun in a People magazine interview in October of 1990 escalated through a presidential speech in January of 1992, produced a 3-day cartoon response, generated a full episode of the show in 1996, and continued to be referenced by the show's own producers for over 2.5 decades, had outlasted not only the presidency of George H.W. Bush, but the entire political era he had represented. The former president himself died on November 30th, 2018, at the age of 94 at his home in Houston. The Simpsons did not produce a special episode to mark his passing. The grudge, in its long, quiet way, was simply allowed to come to its natural end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of the Bushes is the story of a feud the show could not let go. The next story is about the writing room that built the period almost everyone agrees was the show's creative peak, and the men whose names are still attached to the most beloved half hours the show ever produced. Section 4, The Golden Era and the Writers Who Built the Best Years. The third season of The Simpsons aired across 1991 and 1992. By the time the season was being prepared in the spring of 1991, the show had begun to settle into a rhythm that the production team had not fully achieved during the first 2 seasons. The first season had been a scramble. The animation had often arrived late from the overseas studios. The voice cast had been finding the characters as they went. The writing room had been figuring out what the show was actually about. The second season had introduced enormously beloved episodes, including the first Treehouse of Horror in October of 1990, but had still felt, in places, like a young show finding its identity. By the third season, the identity had been found. The show knew what it was. The audience knew what it was. The merchandise machine had passed through its first peak, and the Bart Mania frenzy had begun to settle. The actual creative core of the show, the part that would later be remembered as its greatest achievement, was about to begin. The first major figure in that creative core, beyond Matt Groening and James L. Brooks, was the producer Sam Simon. Simon had been brought into the production by Brooks at the very beginning of the half-hour series. He had been given the title of creative supervisor. He had taken on the actual organization improvisational work that turned a small lobby sketch into a functioning television production. The director, Brad Bird, who would later go on to direct The Iron Giant and The Incredibles for Pixar, but had been an early Simpsons consultant, would later describe Simon as the unsung hero of the show. Simon had assembled the original writing room. He had worked out the procedures by which scripts would be developed, broken into acts, and sent to the animation studios. He had set the early tone. He had also, by all accounts, fought constantly with Groening, Brooks, and the production company Gracie Films. The conflicts grew serious enough that by 1993, Simon had decided to leave the show. Before he left, however, he negotiated a contract that would prove to be one of the most profitable single agreements in the history of American television. He would receive a share of the profits from the show every year for the rest of his life. He would receive an executive producer credit on every episode forever, regardless of whether he had any involvement in producing the episode. He would walk away from the day-to-day work, but never from the financial benefits of having helped build it. Simon would honor this agreement until his death from colon cancer in March of 2015, donating much of the income to animal welfare causes through the Sam Simon Foundation that he established in the later years of his life. The original writing room that Simon had assembled was, in retrospect, one of the most extraordinary collections of comedy writers ever brought together for a single American television show. Names included John Swartzwelder, who would write more individual episodes of The Simpsons than any other writer in the show's history, and would become a kind of legendary recluse within the production, almost never appearing in public and producing scripts that were widely considered the funniest in the entire run. Swartzwelder rarely attended writers' room sessions in person during the later years of his time on the show. He would deliver his scripts on paper and depart without participating in the rewriting process. Other writers in the room, including Conan O'Brien, who had a brief but influential stint on the staff before leaving to host Late Night, would sometimes describe Swartzwelder's drafts as so polished and so precise that the rest of the room had little to add. The names included John Vitti, whose episodes would shape much of the early Bart and Lisa material, and who would later move on to develop animated films of his own. The names included George Meyer, the writer whom many of his colleagues would later credit as the single most important creative voice in the early room, the man whose sensibility most defined what the show found funny. Meyer was once described in a New Yorker profile by David Owen, published in March of 2000, as having an influence on American comedy comparable to that of major literary figures, despite almost no general public awareness of his name. The names included Jeff Martin, the serious music fan who would later produce the Season 5 Beatles parody Homer's Barbershop Quartet. The names included Al Jean and Mike Reiss, the writing partnership that would take over as showrunners for Seasons 3 and 4, and would later be the duo that returned Al Jean to the showrunner chair from Season 13 onward. The names included Jay Kogan and Wallace Wolodarski, another writing partnership. The room was full. The room was deep. The room was about to produce some of the most acclaimed work in American television comedy. Conan O'Brien himself joined the writing room during the third season. He would only stay on the show for a relatively short period before leaving to take over the late night slot at NBC in 1993, but his contribution during his brief tenure was significant. He wrote or co-wrote a small number of episodes that would later be cited among the most beloved in the entire run of the show. He wrote Marge vs. the Monorail, the Season 4 episode in which Springfield was sold a useless monorail system by a smooth-talking salesman named Lyle Lanley. He wrote Homer Goes to College, the Season 5 episode in which Homer was forced to retake basic college courses to keep his job at the nuclear plant. He contributed to several other scripts during his short stay. The pattern of writers passing through the room and going on to major careers elsewhere would become one of the defining features of the show's long life. The Simpsons writing room, by the middle of the 1990s, had become a kind of accidental graduate school for American comedy. Writers who passed through it would go on to create or produce some of the most successful comedies of the next 2 decades, including Greg Daniels, who would later co-create The Office and Parks and Recreation, and Mike Reiss, who would later co-create the animated comedy The Critic. The third season ran across 1991 and 1992 under the showrunners Al Jean and Mike Reiss. The episodes that came out of that season included Stark Raving Dad with the Michael Jackson cameo, Lisa's Pony, Bart the Murderer, Saturdays of Thunder, Flaming Moe's, Burns Verkaufen der Kraftwerk, I Married Marge, Radio Bart, Lisa the Greek, Homer at the Bat with the Major League Baseball ensemble cast, Separate Vocations, Dog of Death, Colonel Homer, Black Widower, The Otto Show, Bart's Friend Falls in Love, and Brother Can You Spare 2 Dimes. The season won critical acclaim almost from the first broadcast. Television writers covering the show began to use phrases like the best comedy on television. The audience size grew. The merchandising kept selling. The fourth season, also under Jean and Reiss, ran across 1992 and 1993 and produced episodes that would later be cited routinely on best of television lists. Camp Krusty, A Streetcar Named Marge, Homer the Heretic, Lisa the Beauty Queen, Itchy and Scratchy the Movie, Marge vs. the Monorail, Selma's Choice, Brother from the Same, Planet, I Love Lisa, Duffless, Last Exit to Springfield, The Front, Whacking Day, Marge in Chains, Krusty Gets Cancelled. The fourth season, by general critical agreement, was when the show reached its first true creative peak. Last Exit to Springfield, in particular, has been cited by multiple critics over the decades as possibly the single best episode of the entire run. The plot followed Homer's accidental rise to leadership of the nuclear power plant labor union and his successful negotiation against Mr. Burns to restore the dental plan that had been removed from the workers' contract. The episode contained, in its 22 minutes, satire of corporate greed, satire of organized labor, a sustained parody of the film The Godfather, a parody of the Beatles film Yellow Submarine, a sustained running joke about Lisa needing braces, and a closing musical number performed by Mr. Burns. The density of the writing in episodes like Last Exit to Springfield was, by general agreement among television critics, almost unprecedented in American animated television. By the end of the fourth season, in 1993, Al Jean and Mike Reiss decided to step down from the showrunner role. The show was handed to David Merkin, a writer and director who had previously worked on the cult sitcom Get a Life, the short-lived Fox program that had starred Chris Elliott as a 30-year-old paperboy still living with his parents. Merkin took over for seasons 5 and 6. The general consensus among longtime fans is that the Merkin era pushed the show toward more outrageous and surreal humor. Episodes like Treehouse of Horror 5, Itchy and Scratchy Land, Bart's Comet, and Lisa on Ice came out of this era. The fifth season also produced Cape Fear, the parody of the 1962 thriller Cape Fear, in which Sideshow Bob, voiced by Kelsey Grammer, attempted to murder Bart Simpson and ended up stepping on rakes for nearly a full minute of screen time. The Merkin seasons were enormously beloved. They were also, in some readings, the beginning of a small drift away from the more grounded character work of the Jean and Reiss seasons. The drift was, at the time, almost imperceptible. It would become more visible only in retrospect. The sixth season closed with one of the most discussed two-part episodes the show would ever produce. Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 1 and Part 2, a deliberate parody of the Dallas television cliffhanger from 1980, in which the audience was invited to spend the entire summer between seasons speculating about which of dozens of Springfield residents had attempted to murder the nuclear plant owner. The mystery had its own toll-free phone number. The mystery had its own merchandise tie-ins. The mystery dominated television commentary across the summer of 1995. After Merkin came the partnership of Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein. The two of them ran seasons 7 and 8. Oakley and Weinstein had been writers in the original Room. They had a clear sense of the show's identity. Their 2 seasons together would later be cited by many fans as the absolute pinnacle of the show's run. The episodes from those years included Lisa the Vegetarian, Treehouse of Horror 6 with the famous Homer in 3 Dimensions segment, in which Homer was rendered using early computer-generated animation and ended up in a live-action sequence walking through the streets of an actual Los Angeles neighborhood. King Size Homer, Mother Simpson, Marge Be Not Proud, Lisa vs. Malibu Stacy, Bart vs. Australia, Two Bad Neighbors, The Day the Violence Died, 22 short films about Springfield, Raging Abe Simpson and his grumbling grandson in The Curse of the Flying Hellfish, Much Apoo About Nothing, Summer of 4'2". The 8th season, which ran across 1996 and 1997, included episodes that almost any list of the greatest Simpsons half-hours would mention: The Springfield Files, Hurricane Nettie, El Viaje Misterioso de Nuestro Homer, Mountain of Madness, Homer's Phobia, Brother from Another Series, My Sister, My Sitter, Homer vs. the 18th Amendment, Grade School Confidential, The Twisted World of Marge Simpson, The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie Show, Homer's Enemy, The Simpsons Spin-Off Showcase, The Old Man and the Lisa, In Marge We Trust. The episodes from this run had a specific quality that fans and critics would later try to articulate in various ways. The shows were fast. The jokes were dense. The emotional beats were earned. The character work was specific. The episodes did not feel like they were following a formula. Each one felt like its own small, contained piece of work. Homer's Enemy, in particular, has been studied as a kind of formal experiment. The episode introduced a new character named Frank Grimes, a hard-working and disciplined man who came to the nuclear plant as a new employee and quickly developed a deep hostility toward Homer Simpson. Grimes could not understand how a man as lazy and incompetent as Homer had achieved a comfortable middle-class life with a loving family, a house, and a stable job, while Grimes himself, who had worked hard and suffered for everything he had, lived in a small apartment above a bowling alley. The episode followed Grimes through a slow psychological breakdown that ended with his accidental electrocution at the plant. The funeral scene at the end of the episode, in which Homer slept through the eulogy and the assembled mourners laughed at his snoring, has been cited by many critics as one of the darkest single moments the show would ever produce. The episode itself was a kind of meta-commentary by the writers on the show's own central character. The writers were essentially asking what would happen if a realistic person were placed inside the world of Springfield. The answer, as the episode delivered it, was that the realistic person would not survive contact with the absurdity of the world. The supporting cast of Springfield by the 7th and 8th seasons had grown enormously. Sideshow Bob had become a recurring villain, played by Kelsey Grammer. Frank Grimes had appeared in the season 8 episode Homer's Enemy, and had become one of the most discussed single appearance characters in television history. Hank Scorpio had appeared in the same season as the supervillain employer of Homer in You Only Move Twice. The town of Springfield had been built out into a fully populated fictional universe. Mr. Burns, Smithers, Reverend Lovejoy, Apu, Moe, Barney, Krusty, Sideshow Mel, Principal Skinner, Superintendent Chalmers, Edna Krabappel, the long line of one-off characters voiced by Phil Hartman, including Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz. The world had become deep enough that any random street scene contained jokes the audience would notice on third or fourth viewing. The 8th season episode, 22 Short Films About Springfield, written primarily by Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein and directed by Jim Reardon, was an experimental piece that abandoned the standard plot structure entirely and instead presented 22 brief vignettes following different residents of the town across a single day. The episode contained the now legendary steamed ham sequence, in which Principal Skinner attempted to host Superintendent Chalmers for an unforgettable luncheon, and ended up burning the roast, sneaking out the back window, buying hamburgers from the local Krusty Burger, and presenting them as homemade Albany regional cuisine. The steamed ham sequence, in the long internet age that would follow the original broadcast, would become possibly the single most parodied and remixed Simpsons scene of all time, generating thousands of fan-made variations across video sharing platforms. Beneath the writing was the animation. The work done by the overseas studios, primarily ACOM and Rough Draft Studios in South Korea, had reached a level of consistency that the early seasons had never achieved. The character models were stable. The backgrounds were detailed. The crowd scenes contained dozens of specific, recognizable Springfield residents. The visual jokes that had been a small part of the early seasons had grown into a major component of how each episode functioned. A typical episode of The Simpsons in the 7th or 8th season contained dozens of small visual gags that did not exist in the dialogue at all. A sign in the background of a single shot, a poster on a wall, a label on a product in a store, a vehicle parked in a driveway. The audience that wanted to find these jokes could find them. The audience that did not want to find them could simply enjoy the surface of the episode. The show had achieved a kind of layered density that television comedy had rarely managed before. The most striking visual tradition the show developed in this period was the annual Halloween special. The first one had aired in October of 1990 during the second season, under the title The Simpsons Halloween Special. The episode had been inspired by the EC Comics horror anthologies of the 1950s, particularly Tales from the Crypt. It had consisted of 3 separate self-contained stories told by the Simpson children inside their backyard treehouse, with an opening warning from Marge that the content might be too frightening for young viewers. The first segment had parodied the Amityville Horror and Poltergeist. The second had introduced the recurring alien characters Kang and Kodos in a story that drew on a famous Twilight Zone episode called To Serve Man. The third segment had been an animated adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's 1845 poem The Raven, narrated by James Earl Jones. The episode had been considered enough of a creative risk that Matt Groening himself, before broadcast, had worried that the Raven segment would be seen as the worst and most pretentious thing the show had ever done. The episode had aired on October 25, 1990. The audience had loved it. The Raven segment in particular had been singled out for praise. The annual tradition had been born almost by accident. By the third season, the show was producing a Treehouse of Horror episode every year. The episodes were given Roman numerals, starting with Treehouse of Horror 2 in 1991, and the count would eventually run to 36 and counting. The Halloween episodes were considered non-canonical. The episodes did not have to obey the show's normal rules of realism. The Simpson family could die in them, be turned into monsters, be transported into alternate dimensions, or be killed off entirely. The freedom of the Halloween anthology format gave the writers a place to try things they could never try in a regular episode, and the tradition became, across the years, one of the most beloved parts of the show's long calendar. The Treehouse of Horror tradition would eventually outlast the golden era it had been born inside of. The tradition would continue across the long decline of the show, through the showrunner changes, through the cast deaths, through the cultural reckonings, through the network ownership changes, all the way to the present. The episodes would change over time. The early ones would feature opening graveyard sequences with humorous tombstones, including jokes about canceled television series, deceased celebrities, and one tombstone simply marked TV violence, riddled with bullet holes. The graveyard sequences would be retired by the 5th episode. The Marge warnings would also be retired. The framing devices that connected the 3 segments would gradually fade away. By the later seasons, the Treehouse of Horror episodes would consist of simply 3 loosely related segments with a brief opening title card. But the basic shape of the tradition, the willingness to abandon continuity once a year and let the writers and animators do whatever they wanted, would persist all the way through. The 8th season ended in May of 1997. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein stepped down from the showrunner role. The writing room had been through almost its entire original generation. The next showrunner was Mike Scully, a writer who had been on the staff since the 5th season. His arrival would mark the end of the era almost everyone agreed had been the show's creative peak. The signs that something was about to change were quiet at the time. They would only become loud later. The show, in the spring of 1997, was, by any reasonable standard, the best comedy program in American television. The show was about to enter a decade in which fans would argue, episode by episode, season by season, about exactly when that distinction had quietly slipped away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of the Golden Era is the story of a writing room that managed to produce, year after year, some of the best half hours of American television comedy ever made. The next story is about the single episode that many fans still cite almost 3 decades later as the moment when the cracks first began to show, and the showrunner who has carried the blame for everything that followed. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper and the Cracks That Started Showing. The 9th season of The Simpsons aired across 1997 and 1998. The transition into the new season had been complicated in ways that the audience watching at home did not fully see. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein had stepped down from the showrunner role at the end of the 8th season. The new showrunner was Mike Scully, who had joined the writing staff back in the 5th season as a junior writer. Scully was, by every account from his colleagues, a hard-working and deeply experienced television writer. He had paid his dues in the room. He had earned the chair. The handover was not as clean as a single sentence makes it sound, however. Several episodes that aired during the early 9th season had actually been produced under Oakley and Weinstein. Several others had been produced as transitional episodes between regimes. The boundaries between the 8th and 9th seasons, in production terms, were softer than the broadcast schedule made them appear. The audience saw a continuous run of new episodes. The production saw a slow handover of control across many months. The result was that the 9th season is, in retrospect, one of the strangest and most divisive seasons in the entire run of the show. It contains some of the most respected episodes the show ever produced. It also contains the single episode that, more than any other, would later be cited by fans and critics as the moment when something fundamental in the show had begun to break. The episode aired on Fox in the United States on September 28, 1997. It was the second episode of the 9th season. It was written by Ken Keeler, the same writer who had handled Two Bad Neighbors. It was directed by Stephen Dean Moore. It was given the title The Principal and the Pauper. The premise of the episode, on paper, was a wild swing. The story revealed that Seymour Skinner, the long-established principal of Springfield Elementary School and one of the most beloved supporting characters on the show, was not actually Seymour Skinner. The principal, who had been at the center of dozens of episodes across the previous 8 seasons, who had been engaged in a long, quiet romance with the teacher Edna Krabappel, who had been the long-suffering disciplinarian of Bart Simpson, was revealed to be a man named Armin Tamzarian. Armin Tamzarian was, in the world of the episode, a small-time street kid from the city of Capital City who had served alongside the real Seymour Skinner during the Vietnam War. The real Skinner had been declared missing in action. Tamzarian, returning from the war, had traveled to Springfield to deliver the news to the real Skinner's mother. The mother had mistaken Tamzarian for her own son. Tamzarian had not corrected her. He had stayed in Springfield. He had taken her son's name. He had eventually become principal of the same elementary school the real Skinner had been preparing to inherit before going off to war. The real Skinner, who had not actually died in Vietnam, but had been held prisoner for decades, finally returned to Springfield in the present day of the episode. The town was forced to choose between the real Skinner and the fake one. The real Skinner was awkward, stiff, and unfamiliar. The fake Skinner was the man the audience and the town had known for years. The town eventually decided that they preferred the fake Skinner. A judge in the episode formally declared that nobody in Springfield was ever to mention the events of the episode again, on penalty of torture. The real Skinner was banished from the town. The fake Skinner returned to his job. The episode ended. The reaction at the time of broadcast was, by every available account, immediate and severe. Longtime fans of the show, who had spent 8 years building their relationship with Principal Skinner as a character, did not enjoy being told that the character had been a lie the entire time. The writing staff itself, by multiple accounts, had not been unified in support of the premise. Many of the writers who had worked under Oakley and Weinstein in the previous seasons were said to have disliked the script during table reads. The episode had been pushed through anyway. The audience watched. The audience reacted. The complaints in fan communities, in television columns, in early internet message boards were sharp and consistent. The episode had violated the basic continuity of the show. The episode had treated a beloved supporting character as a disposable joke. The episode had introduced a major canonical revelation only to have it formally wiped from the show's memory by a judge's decree at the end of the same half hour. The decree at the end of the episode, in which the show effectively declared that the episode itself had not happened, was received by many fans as an admission of failure on the part of the writers themselves. The internal response inside The Simpsons production was almost as striking as the external response. Most of the staff, in interviews given over the years that followed, distanced themselves from the episode. Matt Groening himself was reported to have disliked the premise. Several of the senior writers who had worked on it later described it as a mistake. The official act of declaring the events of the episode forbidden by the judge, an act that read at the time of broadcast as a kind of joking bookend, was treated by the show itself in subsequent seasons as essentially literal. Principal Skinner returned in later episodes as the same Principal Skinner the audience had always known. The Tamzarian backstory was rarely mentioned. The events of the episode were, in functional terms, written out of the show's working continuity within months of having been introduced. The single episode had been so widely disliked that the writing room itself had agreed, without ever quite saying it out loud, to pretend it had never aired. The episode was, however, only the most visible of a series of small structural shifts that longtime fans had begun to notice across the early 9th season. The character of Homer Simpson had begun to behave in ways that would later be described by fans, with increasing frequency, as jerk-ass Homer. The Homer of the early seasons had been a flawed but emotionally legible figure. He was lazy, he drank too much, he made bad financial decisions. He was, however, also genuinely loving toward his wife and children, capable of moments of real tenderness, and aware in some small way of his own failings. The Homer who began to emerge in the 9th season and the seasons that followed was different. He was louder. He was angrier. He was more openly selfish. He damaged property more often. He humiliated his children more often. He treated Marge with less affection. The shift was not a single moment. The shift was a slow drift across seasons. Some fans noticed it almost immediately. Others did not notice it for years. The drift would, however, become one of the most discussed criticisms of the entire post-Golden Era period of the show. The other major shift was structural. The episodes of the early Simpsons had been built, almost without exception, around character-driven stories. A situation arose, a character wanted something, the character pursued the goal. The character either succeeded or failed in a way that revealed something about who they were. The plots had been simple. The complexity had lived in the writing of the characters. The episodes that began to emerge in the late 9th season and beyond often inverted that pattern. The plots became more elaborate. The settings became more exotic. The character moments became less central. Episodes set in foreign countries began to appear with increasing frequency. Episodes built around high-concept premises rather than around character beats began to dominate the production calendar. The shift was not absolute. Plenty of late 90s episodes still contained strong character work. The general direction, however, had changed. The show was becoming, slowly, a show about plot. The 9th season was not, however, a complete failure. The same season that produced The Principal and the Pauper also produced episodes that fans would later cite as among the best of the entire run. The 5th episode of the season, The Cartridge Family, was a sharply written piece on American gun culture that the British broadcaster Sky One would refuse to air for years because of its content. The 11th episode, All Singing, All Dancing, was a clip show built around musical numbers from the show's history. The 20th episode, The Trouble with Trillions, featured a guest appearance by Paul Winfield. The 21st episode, Girly Edition, gave Bart and Lisa their own television news segments at the local station. And the 25th and final episode of the season, Trash of the Titans, was a deliberate showcase of everything the show could still do at its best. Trash of the Titans had been promoted as the show's 200th episode milestone. Mike Scully, in a July 1997 interview with USA Today, had spoken at length about the careful selection of which episode would carry the milestone label. He had wanted an episode that combined corporate satire, political satire, a strong Homer story, full participation from the family, and a major production number. The episode delivered on all of those. Steve Martin guest starred as the soft-spoken sanitation commissioner Ray Patterson. The Irish rock band U2 appeared as themselves on the European leg of their Pop Mart tour. The episode won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program for the 1997 to 1998 season, the show's 7th Emmy in the category. The 200th episode milestone, by every available measure, had been hit cleanly. The season 9 that produced these strong episodes was also the season that produced an episode many fans considered an unforgivable continuity error. The two facts were not contradictions. They were the same season behaving in two different directions at the same time. The show was simultaneously capable of producing some of the best television comedy on the air and some of the most baffling creative decisions in its own history. The 9th season was, in this specific sense, the precise transition point. The seasons that came before it were almost universally considered the show's greatest period. The seasons that came after it were almost universally considered the start of its long decline. The dividing line ran straight through the middle of the 9th season, and almost everyone who has ever written about the show has eventually had to draw the line in roughly the same place. The other major event that affected the show during the 1998 production calendar was a real-world tragedy that struck the voice cast in a way that the show had not been prepared for. The actor Phil Hartman had been one of the most beloved guest voice performers on The Simpsons for years. He had originated the role of Troy McClure, the washed-up B-movie actor whose introductions to various educational films and Springfield television specials had become some of the most quoted moments in the entire run of the show. He had also created the role of Lionel Hutz, the comically incompetent attorney who represented the Simpson family in dozens of legal misadventures across multiple seasons. Both characters had been built around Hartman's specific vocal range and comedic instincts. Both characters had been recurring features of the show. Both characters had been beloved by the audience. On May 28, 1998, Phil Hartman was killed at his home in Encino, California, by his wife Bryn Hartman in what was determined to be a murder-suicide. He was 49 years old. The death was a shock to the entire American comedy community. Hartman had been a longtime member of the Saturday Night Live cast. He had appeared in films and television series across 2 decades. He had been, by all accounts of the people who worked with him, an unusually generous and well-liked figure inside an industry that did not always reward generosity. The Simpsons production team learned of the death and began the painful conversation about what to do with the characters Hartman had voiced. The show eventually decided that the characters of Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz would be retired. Both characters would simply stop appearing in new episodes. Neither would be recast. Neither would be killed off on screen with a formal death scene. The decision was a quiet act of respect. Hartman had been asked, before his death, whether he would be interested in taking the lead role in a planned live-action Troy McClure feature film. He had said yes. The film had been in development. After his death, the film was abandoned. The character of Troy McClure had effectively died with him. His final speaking role on the show was the 10th season episode Bart the Mother, which aired on September 27, 1998, 4 months after his death. The episode had been recorded before he died. The combination of the principal and the pauper episode, the slow drift in Homer's character, the structural shift toward plot-driven storytelling, and the loss of Phil Hartman made the late 9th and early 10th seasons of The Simpsons feel, in retrospect, like the closing of a particular era and the opening of a new one. The new era would carry the show forward through the next decade and beyond. The new era would produce moments of genuine quality. The new era would, however, never quite recapture the specific sensibility that had defined the seasons before it. The fans who had been watching since the early years would talk about that fact for the next quarter century. The new generation of fans who joined the audience in the late 90s and early 2000s would inherit a different show. Both groups would be correct about the show they were describing. The show had simply at some point during the 9th season become a different program from the one it had been at the start. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of the principal and the pauper is the story of the season when the cracks in the show first showed in plain view. The next story is about the death of one of the most beloved supporting characters the show had ever produced, and how the entire decision to kill her came down to the cost of a single airline ticket between Denver and Los Angeles. Section 6. The death of Maude Flanders and the cost of an airline ticket. The 11th season of The Simpsons aired across 1999 and the year 2000. By the time the season was being put together in the spring and summer of 1999, the show had been on the air for over a decade. The original Golden Era staff that had built the show across seasons 3 through 8 had largely moved on to other projects. The new showrunner, Mike Scully, had been steering the program for 2 seasons by that point. The writing room had cycled through several waves of new staff. The animation studios had hit their stride. The merchandise was still selling. The ratings, while no longer at the peak of the early Bart Mania years, were still strong enough that the show was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most watched, scripted programs on American television. The challenge in front of the producers
producers in the spring of 1999, however, was not creative. It was not even structural. The challenge was a simple contract negotiation involving a single voice actress. The negotiation, by the time it was finished, would lead to the death of one of the most established recurring characters on the show in front of millions of viewers on a single Sunday night in February of the year 2000. The whole sequence of events, told from beginning to end, is one of the strangest and saddest stories in the entire long history of the production. The voice actress at the center of the dispute was a woman named Maggie Roswell. Roswell had been part of the show almost from the very first episode. She had not been cast as a member of the main voice ensemble. She had been cast instead as one of the show's most versatile background voice actresses. She did not play a single character. She played many. She voiced Maud Flanders, the wife of Ned Flanders, a quiet and gentle woman who appeared in dozens of episodes across the first decade of the show. She voiced Helen Lovejoy, the wife of Reverend Lovejoy and the unofficial chief gossip of the Springfield community. She voiced Miss Hoover, Lisa Simpson's second-grade teacher at Springfield Elementary School. She voiced Luann Van Houten, the mother of Bart's best friend Milhouse, who had her own long-running marital subplot across multiple seasons. She voiced a number of smaller characters as needed. She had, by the end of the show's first decade, become an essential part of the supporting voice cast. She was paid less than the main 6 members of the ensemble. The main 6, who had been negotiating their salaries with the network across the years and had successfully pushed the pay into the high 6 figures per episode, had a different contractual structure than the recurring secondary actors. Roswell was treated contractually as part of a separate tier of the show's voice work. The arrangement had worked for years. In 1994, however, Roswell had moved with her family from Los Angeles to Denver, Colorado. The move had been for personal reasons related to her family. The problem was practical. The recording sessions for The Simpsons were held in Los Angeles. The schedule required voice work twice a week, every week, throughout the production cycle of each season. Roswell had agreed to keep the job by flying from Denver to Los Angeles twice a week, recording her lines, and
flying back to Denver. She had done this for several years. The travel was exhausting. The cost of the airfare was significant. The show paid her per episode rather than per flight, which meant that the cost of getting to and from the recording studio came directly out of her own income. By the spring of 1999, as the 11th season was being prepared, Roswell had reached a decision. She could not continue to do this without a raise. The conversation she had with Fox was, by every account that has been given of it over the years, conducted in good faith on her side. She had been earning approximately $2,000 per episode. She asked for an increase to $6,000 per episode. She also offered the network an alternative arrangement that would have made the increase unnecessary. She told Fox that she would be willing to keep working for her existing rate of $2,000 per episode if they would let her record her lines from a studio in Denver and send the audio files to Los Angeles. Either solution would have allowed her to continue voicing the characters she had built. The technology to record voice work in one city and use it in another was already widely available in the industry. Other animated shows had done it for years. The request was reasonable on its face. Fox, however, refused both options. The network came back with a counteroffer of an additional $150 per episode on top of the existing $2,000. The counteroffer did not come close to covering the airfare from Denver to Los Angeles for the multiple round trips required each week. The counteroffer was, in effect, a refusal to negotiate. Roswell turned it down. She quit the show. The producers of The Simpsons were left with a problem. The 11th season was about to enter production. Several of Roswell's characters, including Maud Flanders, Helen Lovejoy, Miss Hoover, and Luann Van Houten, were established members of the supporting cast. The episodes that had already been outlined for the season included scenes that required these characters to speak. The producers needed a solution. The solution they chose was to bring in a replacement voice actress. The replacement was a woman named Marcia Mitzman-Gavin. Gavin had a strong voice acting background. She took over Roswell's roles starting at the beginning of the 11th season. The voices she produced were not exactly the same as Roswell's. They were close enough that most casual viewers did not immediately notice. Longtime fans, however, often noticed. Maud Flanders sounded slightly different. Helen Lovejoy sounded slightly different. Miss Hoover sounded slightly different. The replacement worked, at least in the short term. The 11th season went into production. The episodes were animated. The broadcast schedule was set. Inside the writing room, however, a separate conversation had been taking place across the same months. The conversation was about the upcoming February sweeps period. American television networks for decades had run special promotional efforts during certain weeks of the year, weeks during which Nielsen ratings were used to set advertising rates. The most important of these promotional periods was February sweeps. Networks across all the major channels would air their most attention-grabbing episodes during these weeks. The Simpsons writing room had been considering for some time a story in which one of the established recurring characters of Springfield would die. The death would generate news coverage. The death would draw an audience. The death would give the show a major event for sweeps. The writers had not yet decided which character would die. The conversation had been ongoing. When Maggie Roswell quit the show, the conversation about which character to kill suddenly tilted in one specific direction. Killing off a character voiced by Roswell would solve two problems at the same time. It would give the show a major sweeps event. It would also remove the awkward situation of having a replacement voice actress trying to imitate the original voice for years to come. The discussion narrowed quickly. The character chosen for the death was Maud Flanders. The reasoning given inside the writing room, according to multiple accounts that have surfaced in interviews over the decades, was that Maud was the most expendable of Roswell's characters. Helen Lovejoy was useful as the gossip voice in crowd scenes. Miss Hoover was useful as a school faculty character. Luann Van Houten had a recurring role tied to Milhouse. Maud, by contrast, primarily existed within the Flanders household, where Ned could continue to function as a single father with his two boys, Rod and Todd. The decision was made. The writing room moved forward. The episode was assigned to writer Ian Maxtone Graham. The director was Jim Reardon. The episode was given the title Alone Again, Natura Diddley, a play on the 1972 Gilbert O'Sullivan song Alone Again, Naturally. It aired on the Fox network in the United States on February 13th, the year 2000. The plot was, on the surface, straightforward. The Simpson family and the Flanders family went together to a stock car race at the Springfield Speedway. The event was a typical Sunday afternoon outing for the two families. A group of cheerleaders below the bleachers were firing free promotional t-shirts up into the crowd using small handheld air cannons. The cheerleaders were the kind of background detail the show used in 100 different episodes without anyone thinking twice. Homer, sitting next to Maud Flanders in the stands, removed his shirt in a moment of typical Homer enthusiasm and waved his arms at the cheerleaders, urging them to send him a free t-shirt. The cheerleaders responded to his energy. They turned all of their air cannons in his direction. They fired a salvo of t-shirts toward him at the same moment. What happened in the next 4 seconds was the kind of comedic violence the show had used in countless previous episodes for laughs. Homer, at the very last second, noticed a bobby pin lying on the bleacher floor in front of him. He bent down to pick it up. The wave of t-shirts sailed harmlessly over his head. The shirts struck Maud Flanders, who had been sitting beside him, square in the chest. The force of the impact knocked her backward over the rear of the bleachers. She fell from the top row down to the ground far below. She did not survive the fall. The character was dead. The audience watched it happen on a Sunday night in February. The show that had spent over a decade introducing Maud as a quiet, decent woman and a loving mother to the Flanders boys had killed her in a slapstick accident at a racing event over the course of less than a minute of screen time. The rest of the episode followed the aftermath. The funeral, the grief of Ned Flanders, the slow realization by Homer himself that his decision to park his car in the ambulance loading zone at the Speedway had prevented paramedics from reaching Maud in time to attempt resuscitation. He had played a small but real part in her death. The episode let him register that fact and then let it go. The episode introduced a brief subplot in which Homer, racked with mild guilt, attempted to make a homemade videotape advertising Ned Flanders to single women in town. The tape was intercut with footage of Maggie's birth and assorted other unrelated material. Several women, including Edna Krabappel, responded to the tape and met with Ned, but none of the meetings led anywhere lasting. The episode closed with Ned praying to God in confusion and quiet anger. The credits rolled. The character was permanently gone. The bitter irony of the entire situation came 2 years later, in the year 2002. Maggie Roswell and Fox reached a new contract agreement. The terms of the new agreement were the same terms Roswell had originally offered the network back in 1999. The network agreed to let her record her lines from a studio in Denver. The studio would send the audio files to Los Angeles. The arrangement she had asked for, the arrangement that had been refused so flatly that she had quit the show, was now acceptable to Fox. Roswell returned to the production. She resumed voicing Helen Lovejoy. She resumed voicing Miss Hoover. She resumed voicing Luann Van Houten. The character she had originally created came back in her own voice after 2 years of being voiced by Marcia Mitzman-Gavin. The replacement actress quietly stepped aside. Roswell was once again a member of the supporting cast. There was, however, one character Roswell could not bring back. Maud Flanders had been killed in front of millions of viewers in a stock car racing accident 2 years earlier. The character was canonically dead. There was no plausible way to undo a death the show had spent an entire February sweeps episode building toward. Maud has occasionally appeared in subsequent episodes only as a ghost in heaven sequences, or in brief flashback scenes set before her death. She has never appeared as a living character in a present-day Springfield episode again. The whole sequence of events stays with people who follow the show closely because of how small the original cause was. Maggie Roswell had asked for a few thousand additional dollars per episode, or, alternatively, for permission to record her work from a different city. Fox had refused both requests. A character who had been part of the show for over a decade had been killed off as a direct consequence of that refusal. 2 years later, Fox had agreed to the recording arrangement Roswell had originally proposed. The character could have been kept alive at no additional cost to the network. The character had been killed for a reason that, in hindsight, had not actually existed. The story of Maud Flanders is, in this specific sense, a story about how decisions made in accounting offices can shape what audiences see on television years later. It is also a story about the small moments inside a long-running series when the world outside the writing room reaches in and removes things from the world inside the writing room. The show kept going after Maude died. The Flanders household continued. Ned remarried, eventually to Edna Krabappel. The supporting cast kept evolving. The death, however, stayed permanent. The empty seat at the Flanders dinner table stayed empty. A character who had been built up across hundreds of small appearances had been removed from the world of Springfield because of the cost of an airline ticket, and the cost of the airline ticket had become irrelevant within 24 months of her death. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Maude Flanders is the story of one character who paid the price for a contract dispute. The next story is about the project that the show had been promising audiences for nearly 2 decades. The project that had been rewritten more than 100 times before it ever reached a screen, and the 18-year wait that finally ended on a single Sunday afternoon in the summer of 2007. Section 7. The movie that took 18 years. The idea of a Simpsons feature film had existed inside the production almost from the beginning. The show had been on the air for less than 2 years when the first conversations about a potential theatrical version began circulating among the writers and producers. The basic argument was simple. The show was, by the early 1990s, one of the most popular television properties on the planet. The audience was enormous. The merchandise was selling at unprecedented rates. A feature film built around the Simpson family seemed, at first glance, like an obvious next step. Almost every other major animated property of the era was developing a theatrical version. The early conversations inside the production, however, ran into a problem that would, in different forms, prevent the movie from being made for the next decade and a half. The problem was not financial. The problem was not contractual. The problem was structural. A television episode of The Simpsons ran for 22 minutes. A feature film needed to run for 90. Nobody at the show in those early years had figured out how to write a story large enough to fill the longer running time without losing the specific tonal density that made the half-hour version of the show work. The conversations stalled. The production moved on to the next season. The film stayed in the abstract. Years passed. The show continued. The producers occasionally returned to the idea of a feature film during contract negotiations or merchandising discussions, but the structural problem had not been solved. The early to mid-1990s came and went. The late 1990s came and went. The show passed its 200th episode in 1998. It passed its 300th episode in early 2003. The Simpsons had become, by that point, the longest-running scripted primetime series in American history. The audience that had grown up with the show in the early years was now in their 20s and 30s. A generation of children who had not been born when the show debuted had grown up watching reruns. The cultural footprint of the program was enormous. The feature film, however, still did not exist. The producers continued to discuss it. The writers continued to bring it up at meetings. Nothing moved forward. The first concrete step toward an actual production came in 2001. The voice cast signed contracts that committed them to participating in a future Simpsons feature film whenever one was made. The project had not yet been greenlit by Fox in any formal sense. The script did not yet exist. The director had not been chosen. The release date had not been set. The contracts simply meant that, when the film eventually came together, the actors who voiced Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, Hank Azaria, Harry Shearer, and the rest of the regulars would be obligated to perform their parts. The cast contract was, in retrospect, the moment at which the long, abstract conversation became a concrete project with a known endpoint. The endpoint, however, was still nowhere in sight. The actual production process, when it finally began in earnest in the early 2000s, was unlike anything the show had ever attempted. The writer's room set aside time, in addition to producing the regular weekly episodes, to develop a feature-length script. The team that ended up with primary writing credit on the eventual film consisted
consisted of 11 of the show's most prolific writers. The names included James L. Brooks, Matt Groening, Al Jean, Mike Scully, Ian Maxtone Graham, David Merkin, Mike Reese, Matt Selman, John Swartzwelder, and John Vitti. The list essentially included every senior writer who had ever held the showrunner chair across the show's history. The collaborative writing process produced multiple complete drafts. The drafts were rewritten. The rewrites were rewritten. The total number of full script revisions across the development of the film, by the public counts that the writers themselves have given in interviews over the years, was over 100. The script that eventually went into production was the result of years of repeated drafting, abandoning, and redrafting. The ideas considered and rejected during the long script process became their own small piece of Simpsons folklore. One early concept had the director Steven Spielberg traveling to Springfield to film a movie on location, only to accidentally destroy the entire town as part of the production. The idea was eventually abandoned because the writers decided that Spielberg was not the correct figure to be the agent of Springfield's destruction. Another concept had the Simpson family discovering that their entire lives were being filmed for a reality television show. The idea was rejected as too high concept and too detached from the basic emotional register of the show. Several smaller variations involved disasters of various kinds, alien invasions, time travel, and journeys to other planets. Each idea was tried in some form. Each idea was abandoned. The script that finally emerged was, by the standards of the early concepts, almost modest. It was an environmental story. The town of Springfield would be polluted. The federal government would respond by sealing the town inside an enormous, transparent dome. The Simpson family would escape. Homer would be the agent of the original disaster. Homer would also be the agent of the eventual rescue. The shape of the story was in the end the same shape as a typical episode of the show, simply expanded across 90 minutes. The animation process for the film began in January of 2006. The director was David Silverman, a longtime Simpsons supervising director who had worked on the show since the very early years. The animation work was done across several studios, primarily Film Roman and Rough Draft Studios. The film was rendered in high definition, which was, at the time the production began, a deliberate choice. The television show in 2006 was still being produced in standard definition. The film would be by far the highest resolution Simpsons animation that had ever existed. The animators took advantage of the larger resolution and the larger budget to add a level of detail to character designs and backgrounds that the weekly television production schedule did not allow. The opening Itchy and Scratchy short that begins the film, in which Itchy is shown landing on the moon and abandoning Scratchy, was the first scene to be storyboarded. The voice cast recording was unusually secretive.
The producers, deeply aware of the level of public anticipation around the project, took extraordinary measures to prevent any plot details from leaking before the eventual release. None of the cast members were given scripts to take home and study. The actors were required to learn their lines for any given recording session at the studio itself on the day of recording. Once a session was finished, the scripts were collected and shredded. The actors who had spent 18 years voicing these characters were, for the first time, being asked to perform without being able to prepare in advance. By every account given by the cast members afterward, the experience was disorienting but workable. The characters were so familiar to them at that point that they could perform almost any new dialogue cold. Casting beyond the regular voice ensemble included a small list of additional names. The actor Albert Brooks, who had appeared on the show several times before in roles including the supervillain Hank Scorpio, was cast as the lead antagonist. His character was Russ Cargill, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. Cargill would be the figure who would seal the town under the dome and eventually attempt to destroy it. Other guest performers included Tom Hanks playing himself in a brief promotional cameo, the rock band Green Day playing themselves performing a doom doomed concert on a polluted Lake Springfield in the opening sequence, Joe Mantegna reprising his recurring role as the mob boss Fat Tony, and Kelsey Grammer reprising his recurring role as Sideshow Bob in a small appearance that was eventually deleted from the final cut. The marketing campaign that built up to the release was one of the largest the entertainment industry had ever seen for an animated film. The most visible piece of the campaign was a partnership with the convenience store chain 7-Eleven. 11 7-Eleven locations across the United States and one in Canada were physically transformed into Quick E Marts, the fictional convenience store run by the character Apu Nahasapima on the show. The conversion cost approximately $10 million. The transformed stores sold actual versions of products that had previously existed only inside the world of Springfield. They sold Squishies, the brain-freezing slush drinks. They sold Buzz Cola, the fictional soft drink. They sold Krusty-O's, a sugary breakfast cereal. They sold pink glazed movie donuts, designed to look like the donuts Homer ate constantly on the show. The promotion lasted only a few months, but resulted in a 30% increase in profits for the participating 7-Eleven locations during the campaign period. A separate partnership with Burger King produced themed merchandise and meals. Homer Simpson appeared in a special animated opening monologue at the start of the July 24th, 2007 edition of The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. The Empire State Building in New York was illuminated yellow as a promotional gesture, the first time the building had ever been lit in honor of a film release. The American premiere itself was held in a small town in Vermont. Fox had run a contest among 16 different cities and towns named Springfield across the United States, asking each one to make the case for why their Springfield should host the world premiere. The winner of the contest was Springfield, Vermont, a small town in the southern part of the state. The premiere was held in the local theater on July 21st, 2007. The town was overrun with film industry visitors, journalists, and Simpsons fans for the day. The wider American theatrical release followed 6 days later, on July 27th. The film opened in nearly every major theatrical market in the world simultaneously. The financial performance of the film was a phenomenon. The opening weekend gross in the United States and Canada alone was $74 million. The opening weekend international gross was $96 million across 71 overseas territories. The United Kingdom opening contributed approximately $27.8 million, the second highest opening for a 20th Century Fox film in British history at the time of release. The Australian opening was $13.2 million, the third highest opening weekend in the country and the highest for any animated film. Across its entire theatrical run, the film grossed roughly $527 million worldwide, against a production budget of approximately $75 million. The numbers place the film among the 8th highest-grossing films of 2007 globally. The film became, at the time of release, the highest-grossing film ever based on an animated television series. The record would stand until the Japanese animated feature Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba, the movie Infinity Castle, eventually surpassed it in 2025. The critical reception was generally positive, without being unanimously enthusiastic. Reviewers praised the writing, the humor, the emotional core of the Homer and Marge subplot, the rendering of the animation in higher quality than the show had ever achieved, and the willingness of the script to take real narrative risks. The film won the British Comedy Award for Best Comedy Film. It won Best Animation at the inaugural ITV National Movie Awards. It won Best Movie at the United Kingdom random Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards, defeating, among others, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End, and Shrek the Third. It received a Golden Globe nomination for Best Animated Feature Film. It received 4 Annie Award nominations, including Best Animated Feature, Best Direction in an Animated Feature Production, Best Writing in an Animated Feature Production, and a Best Voice Acting in an Animated Feature Production nomination for Julie Kavner. The home video release on December 3, 2007, generated $11.8 million in rental revenue in its first week. The production also produced a small number of memorable cultural footnotes. The film was rated PG-13 by the Motion Picture Association of America for what the rating board described as irreverent humor throughout. The British Board of Film Classification, by contrast, gave the film a PG with no cuts required, on the basis that the brief nudity in one scene was, in the words of the board's spokeswoman, natural nudity with no sexual content. The country of Myanmar banned the film entirely. The reason for the Myanmar ban was unrelated to the brief nudity or to any of the political content of the script. Myanmar, at the time, prohibited the use of the colors yellow and red in cinema, and the Simpsons film, with its yellow characters and frequently red backgrounds, fell foul of that prohibition. The arrival of the film, after 18 years of false starts, was felt inside the production team as a kind of long-delayed completion. Multiple senior writers, in interviews after the film's release, described the project as something that had hung over the show for so long that finishing it had been a relief. The film also had a quieter, long-term effect on the show itself. The animators who had worked on the high-definition rendering of the film returned to the weekly television production after the film was done. They knew by that point what the Simpson family looked like in higher resolution. The television show was still being produced in standard definition at the time of the film's release. The transition to high-definition production for the television show, which was already being discussed inside the production team in 2007, would happen less than 2 years after the film. The film had served, among other things, as a kind of practice run for the technical change that would, in 2009, formally end the long era of standard definition Simpsons animation. A sequel to the film was discussed in the years immediately following the original release, but did not move into active production for over a decade. The film franchise rights eventually passed, along with the rest of the Simpsons property, to the Walt Disney Company in 2019 as part of the Disney acquisition of 20th Century Fox. A new Simpsons feature film was officially announced for theatrical release on September 3, 2027. The 18-year gap between the original concept and the first feature film had been treated by fans and the producers themselves as a unique anomaly. The 20-year gap between the first film and the eventual second one would, by the time it concluded, be roughly the same length. The Simpsons feature films were turning out, against all expectations, to be a once-in-a-generation event rather than a regular, ongoing franchise. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of the Simpsons movie is the story of a long-awaited project that finally arrived after nearly 2 decades of false starts. The next story is about the technological shift that quietly redrew the entire visual identity of the show, the change that happened in the middle of a single season, and the moment when the rough, hand-drawn era of The Simpsons came to a permanent end. Section 8. The HD transition and the cleaner, cleaner, cleaner look. The 20th season of The Simpsons aired across 2008 and 2009. By the time the season was being prepared in the spring of 2008, the show had been on the air for almost 2 full decades. The production had cycled through showrunners, writers, animators, directors, and several waves of supporting voice actors. The technological foundation underneath all of those changes, however, had remained surprisingly consistent across the entire run. The show, since its launch in 1989, had been produced in standard definition at a 4:3 aspect ratio. Standard definition was the broadcast resolution that American television had used for almost the entire 20th century. The 4:3 ratio meant that the picture on the screen was almost square, slightly wider than it was tall. The Simpsons had been designed with this ratio in mind. Every shot composition had been built around it. Every sight gag had been positioned for the boxier frame. Every background detail had been placed inside the rectangle that televisions had been showing American audiences for 50 years. By the late 2000s, however, the rectangle was changing. Widescreen, high-definition televisions had become standard in American homes. The boxy 4:3 image looked dated on the new screens. The networks were quietly pushing all of their major primetime programming to upgrade. The Simpsons, after 20 seasons, was about to make one of the largest single technical changes in its entire history. The production team had begun preparing for the change well in advance. The Simpsons movie, released in July of 2007, had already been rendered in high definition. The animators who had worked on the film had developed the workflows and the visual standards that would eventually be applied to the weekly television production. The transition to high definition for the show itself, however, was not a single moment. The transition was a slow process that rolled out across the second half of the 20th season. The first 9 episodes of the season, which had actually been produced as part of the previous season's production cycle, aired in the original 4:3 standard definition format. The 10th episode, which aired on February 15, 2009, aired in widescreen 16:9 high definition for the first time. The episode was titled Take My Life, Please. It was written by Don Payne. It was directed by Stephen Dean Moore. The plot of the episode was a flashback story. Homer Simpson, in the present day, learned for the first time that the high school class president election he had lost as a teenager had been rigged. He gained the ability through a magical tomato sauce stirred by a character at Luigi's Italian restaurant to see the alternate timeline in which he had won the election. In the alternate timeline, Homer had become rich, lived in a mansion, retained his hair, and never had children with Marge. The episode followed his slow and reluctant return to gratitude for the actual life he had built. The story itself was, by the standards of the late period of the show, a competent middle-of-the-road episode. The story, however, was not the reason the episode would be remembered. The reason was the visual presentation. Take My Life, Please was the first regular episode of The Simpsons ever broadcast in high definition. The image quality, the line weights, the color palette, the level of background detail, all of it was different from anything the audience had seen on television in 20 years. The transition came with a brand new opening sequence. The show had used essentially the same opening since the second season in 1990. The original sequence had been animated, with various small modifications across the years, in standard definition 4:3. The new sequence, designed specifically for the high-definition widescreen format, was a much more elaborate piece of work. It opened, like the original, with movement through cumulus clouds, but the clouds had been redesigned to look more realistic. Matt Groening, in interviews around the time of the launch, said that the original direction to the animators back in 1990 had been to make the clouds as photorealistic as possible. The technology of 1990 had not been able to deliver that result. The technology of 2009 had finally come close. The new sequence, after passing through the clouds, swept across an expanded view of Springfield that took advantage of the wider 16:9 frame. The town square showed Jimbo and Carney sawing the head off the statue of Jebediah Springfield, a callback to the Season 1 episode, The Telltale Head. The head fell onto the head of Ralph Wiggum, who was holding an ice cream cone. A new running gag was introduced inside the sequence itself. A billboard was placed on the roof of a building across the street from the elementary school. The billboard would change every episode, displaying a different visual joke each week. The first billboard, in Take My Life Please, advertised the local clown Krusty as now doing funerals. The chalkboard gag, the saxophone solo, and the couch gag all continued. The sequence ended, in some episodes, with the family television falling off the wall of the living room and shattering on the floor. The visual changes inside the episodes themselves were significant in ways that went beyond simply looking sharper. The character models had been subtly redrawn. The lines defining the characters were thinner. The proportions of the heads and bodies had been gently adjusted. Some viewers argued that Homer's chin had been reduced slightly. The color palette across the show became brighter and more saturated. The yellows were more vivid. The blues of Marge's hair were richer. The reds of Bart's t-shirt were more deeply red. The backgrounds of Springfield, which had always been detailed but had been rendered in standard definition for 2 decades, suddenly contained levels of small visual detail that had not been possible before. The wider 16:9 frame allowed shots of Springfield streets and crowd scenes to contain more characters on screen at once. Background gags became denser. The visual jokes that the show had always specialized in could now be packed in at higher concentrations. The fan reaction to the new look was not unanimous. Some viewers welcomed the cleaner presentation. Some viewers thought the show looked better than it had looked in years. Other viewers, however, mourned the loss of the rougher, hand-drawn quality of the standard definition era. The lines in the new high-definition production were precise. The lines in the old standard definition era had been slightly imperfect. The old lines had a kind of human warmth that the new lines lacked. Some longtime fans argued, with real feeling, that the imperfection of the older animation had been part of the show's charm. The slight inconsistencies between shots, the small variations in character model proportions from one scene to the next, the soft edges of the older inking process, all of it had given the show a particular handmade quality that the cleaner digital production replaced with something more uniform. The transition was not, in this sense, simply a technological upgrade. The transition changed the basic feel of what the audience was watching. The change was real. The transition had also been preceded by an even quieter technological change that almost nobody outside the production had noticed. The Simpsons had originally been animated using traditional cell animation. The cells were physical sheets of celluloid on which characters were hand-painted. The cells were photographed against painted backgrounds. The process was the same process Disney had used for decades. By the early 2000s, however, the show had begun a slow shift toward digital production. The first episode to use digital ink and paint had been the Season 14 episode Treehouse of Horror 13, which aired in November of 2002. Digital ink and paint replaced the hand-painted cells with computer-based color application. The character drawings were still hand-drawn, but the coloring was done digitally. The shift was almost invisible to viewers at the time. The deeper, full transition to entirely computer-assisted animation, however, would coincide with the high-definition transition 7 years later. By the time of Take My Life, Please in February of 2009, the show had moved fully into a digital production pipeline that used industry-standard software including Toon Boom Harmony for animation and Adobe After Effects for compositing. The era of physical celluloid in Simpsons production had ended. The animators were drawing on tablets, the colors were being applied in software, the compositing was being done in digital workstations. The hand-drawn era, in the strictest sense, was over. The voice cast was also undergoing changes during the transition. The production of Season 20 had been delayed in the spring of 2008 by a contract negotiation between Fox and the 6 main voice actors. The negotiation took longer than expected. The original plan for the season had been to produce 22 episodes. The delay reduced the season to 20 episodes. The salary that the main cast eventually settled on was approximately $400,000 per episode. Dan Castellaneta, the voice of Homer, was given an additional credit as a consulting producer for the first time. The other main cast members, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yardley Smith, Hank Azaria, and Harry Shearer, all received the same per-episode rate. The salary represented a substantial increase from the previous level. It also represented one of the largest per-episode payments to voice actors in the history of American animated television. The deal that emerged from the spring 2008 negotiation would essentially set the financial structure of the show's voice cast for the next several years. The transition to high definition was also, in retrospect, the moment at which a small but persistent quality improvement in the show became visible to certain segments of the audience. Many critics, looking back across the long run of the show, have identified what some have called the Silver Age or Bronze Age of The Simpsons. The argument runs that while the show never returned to the absolute creative heights of the seasons 3 through 8 golden era, the show did experience a real, if modest, creative revival around the time of the high-definition transition. The 20th season received better reviews from television critics than any of the previous several seasons. The IGN critic Robert Canning, in his end-of-season review, gave the season a 7.9 out of 10 and described the season as a welcome resurgence. The episodes of the high-definition era were not, in general, the equal of the great episodes of the seasons 3 through 8 peak. They were, however, frequently better than the worst episodes of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The visual upgrade may have been part of the reason. The voice cast pay raise may have been part of the reason. The departure of various less popular writers and the arrival of new ones may have been part of the reason. None of those factors fully explained the modest improvement, but the improvement was real enough that some segments of the long-term fan community recognized it. The Treehouse of Horror tradition continued through the high-definition transition. The Season 20 Treehouse of Horror, which was numbered 19 because the count started at one less than the season number, had aired earlier in the season in the older standard definition format. The first Treehouse of Horror to be produced fully in high definition would be Treehouse of Horror 20 in Season 21, which aired in October of 2009. The Halloween anthology format gave the new high-definition production team space to experiment with visual ideas that the regular weekly episodes did not allow. The high-definition Treehouse episodes contained more visual effects, more elaborate animation sequences, and more direct parodies of contemporary horror films than the earlier standard-definition Halloween specials had attempted. The high-definition transition was, in the long arc of the show's history, the last major technical upgrade the production would receive. The technological foundation set in February of 2009 would carry the show across the next decade and a half. The production pipeline established for the new format would be refined over time, but never replaced. The animators, Directors, the writers, and the voice cast all eventually settled into the new system. The audience adjusted to the cleaner look. The complaints about the loss of the rougher, hand-drawn aesthetic faded into a low-level background note in longtime fan communities. The Simpsons, which had begun in 1987 as crude pencil sketches drawn by Matt Groening in an office lobby and traced over by animators at Klasky Csupo, had become, by 2009, a fully digital, high-definition, prime-time animated series produced on industry-standard software. The journey from the lobby sketch to the high-definition broadcast had taken 22 years. The show had no intention of stopping there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of the high-definition transition is the story of how the show kept up with the technology of the country that was watching it. The next story is about the cultural change the show could not keep up with. The slow and quiet reckoning around one of the most beloved supporting characters in all of Springfield, and the wave of recasting that gradually changed which voices were allowed to play which residents of the town. Section 9. The Problem with Apu and the Slow Recasting of Springfield. The character of Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon had been part of The Simpsons almost since the beginning. He had first appeared in the 8th episode of the first season, an installment titled The Telltale Head, which aired in February of 1990. The role had been a small one at the start, a single-line piece of background work. The role had grown across the seasons. By the middle of the show's run, Apu had become one of the most fully developed supporting characters in the entire town of Springfield. He owned and operated the Quickie Mart, a 24-hour convenience store that served as a recurring location across hundreds of episodes. He had been given a complete family history. He had emigrated from India to the United States as an adult. He had earned a doctoral degree in computer science before being forced into convenience store work. He had a green card storyline that had been the focus of the Season 7 episode Much Apu About Nothing in May of 1996. He had eventually been given a wife named Manjula and 8 children. The character had been built into one of the most layered supporting figures in Springfield. He had also, from the very first appearance, been voiced by the white American actor Hank Azaria, performing in an exaggerated South Asian accent. The voice had been created almost by accident. According to Azaria's accounts in interviews over the decades, the line, as written in the original script for The Telltale Head, had simply read, in the stage directions, the words, "Definitely not Indian." The instruction had been a deliberate signal from the writers to avoid the obvious cliché. Azaria, at the table read, had ignored the instruction and had read the line in a heavy, exaggerated South Asian accent based on stereotypes from old Hollywood films and on the convenience store workers he had interacted with growing up in Queens. The accent had landed at the table read. The other writers had laughed. The accent had stuck. The character had been built around the voice from that point forward. Azaria had won Primetime Emmy Awards for his voice work. The character had been beloved by the broad American audience for years. The first quiet objections from the South Asian American community had begun in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The objections had not received significant mainstream attention at the time. Various academic writers and cultural critics had argued that the character represented a stereotype that had real consequences for South Asian Americans living in the United States. The arguments had appeared in scattered places. The Simpsons production had not formally responded. The character had continued to appear. The voice had continued to be performed. The conversation broke into the mainstream in November of 2017. The American comedian Hari Kondabolu released a documentary on the cable network True TV. The documentary was titled The Problem with Apu. It ran for 49 minutes. It featured interviews with a range of South Asian American performers and writers, including Aziz Ansari, Kal Penn, Asif Mandvi, Russell Peters, Utkarsh Ambudkar, and Sakina Jaffrey. Each of the interviewees described what it had been like to grow up in the United States as a South Asian American while the character of Apu was on the air. They described being called Apu by other children in school. They described being mocked using the catchphrase, "Thank you, come again." They described being expected to perform the accent for white classmates. They described in some cases being unable to find serious acting work as adults because casting directors associated South Asian voices with a cartoon character. The documentary made a sustained argument that the character had become a tool that other Americans had used to harass and demean actual South Asian people for nearly 3 decades. The response from the show, when it came, was widely considered one of the worst decisions in the modern run. The response appeared inside the regular run of the program in an April 2018 episode of Season 29 titled No Good Read Goes Unpunished. In the relevant scene, Marge sat reading a bedtime story to Lisa. The book had aged poorly. Marge had been forced to soften the language in real time. After finishing, Marge said that perhaps the lesson was that some things considered acceptable in earlier times had to be reconsidered. Lisa turned and looked directly at the camera. She said that something that had started decades earlier and had been applauded and inoffensive at the time had now become politically incorrect. She asked what was a person to do. The shot panned to a framed photograph of Apu on Lisa's bedside table. Marge replied that some things would be addressed in due course. Lisa replied that, if at all. The reaction was severe. The basic argument the response had made, that nothing could really be done about the character because times had changed, was widely received as a deflection. Kondabolu said in interviews that the response had been heartbreaking. Television critics described the scene as a missed opportunity. Hank Azaria himself, asked about the scene, declined to defend it. Azaria, in interviews across 2018 and 2019, began to take a different position from the show itself. He spoke at length about his growing discomfort with the character. He described attending seminars on representation. He described meeting a 17-year-old high school student of South Asian descent who, despite never having watched The Simpsons, knew exactly what the word Apu meant when it was used as an insult. The decision became public in January of 2020. Azaria announced that he would no longer voice the character of Apu. He said in the interview that he had concluded he was, in his own words, participating in a harm. He said the character had been used as a slur during physical attacks on actual convenience store workers. The character was not formally killed off. The character simply stopped speaking. Apu continued to appear in occasional non-speaking background cameos, but the voice was no longer present. The active life of the character on the show, after roughly 30 years of regular appearances, had quietly ended. The decision around Apu was not the only voice cast change of the period. The country at large was passing through a particular cultural moment in the late spring and early summer of 2020. The Black Lives Matter protests that followed the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25, 2020, were the largest civil rights protests the country had seen in decades. Across multiple animated programs, white voice actors who had been playing black or other non-white characters began to step aside. Jenny Slate left the role of Missy on Big Mouth. Mike Henry left the role of Cleveland Brown on Family Guy. The Simpsons producers responded with a formal statement in late June of 2020, saying that the show would no longer have white actors voice non-white characters. The recastings rolled out across the next several months. Carl Carlson, Homer's longtime friend at the nuclear plant, was the first. The new voice, beginning with the season 32 premiere in September of 2020, was the actor Alex Désert, a Haitian-born American actor who had appeared on the FX program Better Things. Désert took over both Carl and Officer Lou. The Latino character Bumblebee Man was recast as well, with the Cuban-born American actor Eric Lopez taking the role. The replacement of Dr. Hibbert came in February of 2021. Harry Shearer, who had voiced the character since the second season, performed the role for the final time in the season 32 episode Diary Queen. The new voice was the Black American actor Kevin Michael Richardson, who had voiced characters on Family Guy, American Dad, and Guardians of the Galaxy. A separate voice cast change had been forced on the show years earlier by the death of the longtime supporting actress Marcia Wallace, who had voiced Edna Krabappel since the very first season. Wallace died on October 25, 2013, at the age of 70. The producers retired the character rather than recast her. The first acknowledgement came in the season 25 episode 4 Regrettings and a Funeral. The chalkboard gag that week was changed to a single repeated line. The line read simply the words, "We will really miss you, Mrs. K." The full closing of the character came in the later season 25 episode, The Man Who Grew Too Much, which showed Ned Flanders wearing a black armband beside framed photographs of both Edna and Maude. Ned had now lost 2 wives. The character of Apu, the character of Edna Krabappel, the character of Maude Flanders, and the various other recurring residents of Springfield who had been recast or retired across the long modern history of the show all sat together by the early 2020s in a kind of quiet record of how the cultural and biological clock had slowly altered the voice cast that the audience had grown up listening to. The Simpson family at the center of the show remained intact. The town around them had changed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Apu and the recastings is the story of a show forced to reckon with its own past. The next story is about the corporate transition that placed the entire run of the program under a new owner, and the long final stretch of the show's evolution into the longest-running scripted primetime series in American history. Section 10, Disney Plus, The Cropped Frames, and the Show That Refused to End. The deal that placed The Simpsons under new ownership had been in progress for several years before it was completed. The Walt Disney Company, by the middle of the 2010s, had been pursuing an aggressive program of acquisition. Disney had purchased Pixar in 2006, Marvel Entertainment in 2009, and Lucasfilm in 2012. By the late 2010s, the company had set its attention on a much larger target. The target was 21st Century Fox. The Fox library included thousands of hours of programming. The library also included the entire production history of The Simpsons. The deal was announced in late 2017 and closed on March 20th, 2019. The Walt Disney Company became the legal owner of The Simpsons and of every episode that had ever aired. The acquisition came at a specific moment in the broader entertainment industry. The American television market was in the middle of a major shift towards streaming services. Disney had decided to launch its own dedicated service. The new service was given the name Disney Plus. The launch was scheduled for November 12, 2019, less than 8 months after the Fox acquisition closed. The Simpsons was identified almost immediately as a launch day priority. The streaming service would, on its first day of operation, offer subscribers the entire run of The Simpsons in one place. 650 plus episodes. The launch arrived. The promise turned out to be more complicated than the marketing had suggested. The complication had to do with the aspect ratio of the older episodes. The first 19 seasons of the show had been produced in the original 4:3 standard definition format. The transition to high-definition widescreen had only happened in the middle of season 20 in February of 2009. When Disney Plus launched, the older episodes were not presented in their original aspect ratio. They were presented in a remastered 16:9 format. The cropping had been done by trimming the top and bottom of the original 4:3 image. The older episodes, when streamed on Disney Plus, looked superficially correct on a modern widescreen television. The cost of the appearance, however, was the loss of significant amounts of visual information. The fan reaction was immediate. Longtime Simpsons viewers began noticing that visual jokes they had memorized from years of rewatching were missing. A famous example involved a scene in which Duff Beer, Duff Light, and Duff Dry Beer were all shown coming out of the same large industrial pipe. The original joke depended on being able to see all three brand labels at the same time. The cropped version on Disney Plus showed only two of the three. The joke had been silently cut out of the image. Disney issued a formal response, acknowledging the issue and promising a fix in early 2020. The fix took longer than the timeline suggested. By late May of 2020, Disney Plus finally rolled out the option. Subscribers could now find a toggle in the details menu labeled Remastered Aspect Ratio. Switching the toggle to off restored the original 4:3 aspect ratio for the first 19 seasons. The visual jokes that had been cropped out came back into view. The Disney Plus launch had also handled one specific older episode in a way that almost no other long-running series had ever been handled. The third season episode, Stark Raving Dad, which had featured a guest voice performance by Michael Jackson, was not included in the streaming catalog. The episode had been removed from the show's official catalog earlier in 2019, in the months following the release of the documentary Leaving Neverland on HBO. The decision had been made by James L. Brooks, Al Jean, and the documentary's director, Dan Reed. Of all the episodes the show has ever produced, only one has been formally erased from the official streaming archive. The Simpsons continued producing new episodes through the entire transition. The 31st season aired across 2019 and 2020. The 36th season concluded in May of 2025. The show had aired over 770 individual episodes. The total count had passed every other scripted primetime series in American television history. The previous record holder, the Western drama Gunsmoke, had concluded its original run in 1975 at 635 episodes. The Simpsons had passed that total in season 29. The show had then kept going for another 7 full seasons after passing the record. The recent seasons have continued to produce moments that the long-term fan community has registered as significant. In April of 2024, in a season 35 episode titled Cremains of the Day, the show formally killed off Larry Dalrymple, a long-running barfly character who had been seen sitting silently at Moe's Tavern for over 30 years. The episode treated the loss with unusual, quiet seriousness. Co-executive producer Tim Long said in interviews that the writers had wanted to use Larry's death to make a small point about how even the most peripheral people in any given person's life had dignity and worth. The voice cast itself, by the middle of the 2020s, had begun to reflect the long passage of time. Dan Castellaneta had passed his 65th birthday. Julie Kavner had passed her 70th. The cast that had originally come together in the makeshift recording studio above the bleachers on the Tracy Ullman Show set in 1987 was, by 2025, an aging ensemble that had been performing the same characters for nearly 4 decades. The voices had held up remarkably well. A new feature film had been announced for theatrical release on September 3rd, 2027, nearly 20 years after the original 2006 2007 film. The arc that runs from the lobby sketch of 1986 to the streaming catalog of the 2020s is one of the strangest and most extended arcs in American media history. A cartoonist drew 5 characters in the lobby of an office because he did not want to license his existing work. Those characters became a cultural phenomenon. They generated $2 billion of merchandise revenue in their first 14 months on the air. They survived a long creative peak across seasons 3 through 8. They survived a long creative decline. They survived the death of major supporting figures, the contract disputes, the long-awaited feature film, the technological transition, the cultural reckoning around their most beloved supporting character, the corporate acquisition, the streaming launch that initially cropped their visual jokes out of view, and the slow, steady aging of the voice cast. The production has simply kept going. New episodes have continued to air on Sunday nights. New episodes have continued to be added to the Disney Plus catalog. New Treehouse of Horror specials have continued to arrive every October or November. New chalkboard gags have continued to appear at the start of each new episode. The family at the center has remained intact. Homer still works at the nuclear power plant. Marge still keeps the household running. Bart is still in the 4th grade. Lisa is still in the 2nd grade. Maggie is still a baby. The town of Springfield still surrounds them. The show has, in this specific sense, achieved something almost no other piece of American popular culture has achieved. It has become a kind of permanent cultural fixture rather than a finite work of art. It has become a long, ongoing institution. The lobby sketch that Matt Groening drew on a single afternoon in 1986 has, in the long view, turned out to be one of the most consequential acts of casual cartooning in the history of American animation. The cartoon family on Evergreen Terrace, drawn originally as 5 rough sketches in an office lobby nearly 4 decades ago, keeps sitting down for dinner together every week in a yellow kitchen in a small town in an unnamed American state, somewhere inside the long memory of one of the most extraordinary creative projects in the history of American television. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.